Well, there are certainly heightened tensions between Russia and Ukraine, but those fears of war may be the least of everybody's problems. In an op-ed by the New York Times, author Ivan Krastev writes, quote, "On the contrary, Europeans see Mr. Putin as more malicious. War, they reason, is not the Kremlin's game. Instead, it's an extensive suite of tactics designed to destabilize the West. For Europe, the threat of war could turn out to be more destructive than war itself." Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the half hour. My name is Spencer.
My name is YuYu, and because that was morbid, today we're actually not going to talk about Russia and Ukraine. We're actually going to talk about President Biden's cat, Willow.
For those of you who don't know, obviously named after the Taylor Swift song in the album of Evermore. Everybody knows that Taylor Swift is best artist, very, very good at singing. Only her modern music, though, but that's besides the point. Cat is cute. Woo. Cat memes. We want to see them. We want to see them being sent to the half hour Instagram. Link in the description. Do it now. Take 5 minutes of your day, find all of the cat memes of President Biden's cat, send them to the Instagram. Camilla will get mad and we'll be happy. Cool.
Moving on. As much as I would love to talk about President Biden's cat for a whole episode, we do have to talk about more realistic situations that's going on. And this is an episode that is both beneficial to extempers and also debaters, just because it is revolving around the situation between Russia, Ukraine, that also involves Turkey and NATO. So keep listening, especially if you're a PF debater.
And this is a really big deal. As a matter of fact, as we are recording this podcast, things are changing. This is a relatively quick turning topic. For that reason, we have decided that we're going to split this episode into two parts. So this week, you're going to get the background and the cause and effect. Like we're going to have a 30-minute episode specifically on the issues that are happening. Next week will be all the questions. And I think this might actually be a fair thing to say. If you have any questions, shoot us them in the DM and we'll add them into the discussion pool. We're going to have a few questions from Extemp Central. And then if you have any questions, please, I think we'll be more than willing to work through them with you. We're going to spend 30 minutes next week going through a number of questions about Russia and Ukraine. So this is a really good time to learn about this topic. This is a huge issue, and we want to make sure that you guys are informed the best you can be, because this might be the only time that we talk about this topic, unless if it, or for the rest of the Wyoming speech and debate season. So keep your head up.
Yeah. I mean, if World War III breaks out, obviously that's going to change. But for now, I think this two-parter is going to be very helpful in terms of just like breaking this whole situation down and really trying to understand why tensions are so high and why we're seeing so many of the things that we're seeing now, and why US officials, NATO countries, EU countries are all scared about what's going to happen next.
And this is also a little experimental. Let's also note that if this is something that is really good, we may do this again, especially on a topic that is incredibly important, such as Russia and Ukraine. So unless if you have anything else to add beforehand, we're going to just jump right into this. I've got a lot of context to cover. I took this all straight from a Council on Foreign Relations article. It's the first one in the description or in the sources. Literally everything is from that website. And I don't think I left anything out from that website. Like I've got everything written here, just kind of in my own words. and maybe quoted a little bit here and there. Okay? So this conflict is a lot older than what many people may perceive. This is not something that has just happened this year or we heard about in 2021. This has been happening for quite some time. It's just now we've really hit the point where, surprise, Russia and Ukraine might really be at the verge of conflict. We know that the origin of the conflict began in 2013, and this is because of protests that had occurred between Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych, who rejected a deal for a more involved form of economic integration with the European Union. State security forces were violent towards the protesters, and this led to more protesters to come in and fight against Yanukovych. Obviously, this led to the conflict escalating, and it escalated so much that Yanukovych fled the country in early 2014. 2014 is really the important year when studying the conflict that is involved between Russia and Ukraine. In March, the Crimean region of Ukraine was taken over by Russian troops. This happened before Crimeans voted to join the Russian Federation, despite the referendum continuously being disputed to this day. Putin listed the need to do this as important for protecting the rights of Russian speakers and Russian citizens in Crimea and southeast Ukraine. Unfortunately, this led to heightened divisions, and this ultimately led to the Donetsk and Luhansk separatist groups to hold a referendum to declare independence from Ukraine. I apologize, I'm butchering anything. I am not familiar with this language. Okay, since April of 2014, pro-separatist forces that are backed by Russia and the Ukrainian military have led to the killing of nearly 10,300 and injuring of almost 24,000 people. In Russia and Ukraine have been declared an international crisis since July of 2014. During this month, it was a Malaysian Airlines flight that was shot down over Ukraine and killed all 298 aboard the flight. In October of 2015, Dutch air crash investigators officially declared that the plane was shot down by Russia. It was declared that it was by a Russian-built surface-to-air missile. Almost a year later, the investigators found that it was provided by Russia. This means that the surface-to-air missile was transferred to Ukraine by Russia, and then after the attack, the whole system was brought back to Russia. In February 2015, there was the establishment of the Minsk Accords. The Minsk Accords are basically a hope to create a cessation of violence. With Russia and Ukraine, Germany and France are also joined in the accords. The agreement's goals are for a ceasefire in Ukraine and Russia, any withdrawal of heavy weaponry, and Ukrainian government control throughout the zone of the conflict. Obviously, this has been very unsuccessful. NATO became more involved in the conflict in 2016. In April, the organization authorized 4 battalions to Eastern Europe. Troops would rotate through Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. This was in hopes to deter any Russian aggression in Eastern Europe, and most importantly in the Baltics. In order to increase deterrence, 2 U.S. Army tank brigades were sent to Poland in September of 2017. Since the conflict started in 2014, Ukraine has also been the target of many cyber attacks. In an attack in December of 2015, nearly 225,000 people lost power throughout Ukraine. Parts of Kyiv experienced a blackout in December of 2016 after an attack against a Ukrainian utility company. And most importantly was the attack in June 2017. This was the NotPetya cyber attack. The attack was against government and business computer systems in Ukraine. The attack, of course, was attributed to Russia, which ultimately caused billions of dollars worth of damages in Ukraine because the attack spread to so many computer systems. Despite the popular belief of the Trump-Putin bromance, the Trump administration continued to provide security assistance to Ukraine. There was also increased pressure from the Trump administration to Russia. New sanctions were imposed on 21 individuals, which included Russian officials and 9 companies in January 2018. All of them were linked to the conflict that was happening in Ukraine. The first sale of lethal weaponry happened in March 2018, when the United States sold anti-tank weapons to Ukraine. In September of 2018, Russia held its annual military exercises. However, these were the largest that have happened since the fall of the USSR. This resulted in Ukraine joining the United States and NATO in October 2018 to take part in their air exercises in Western Ukraine. One conflict leading to another, or one exercise leading to another. Conflict is still occurring in Ukraine up to this day. The events are still unfolding as we speak. In October 2021, Russia began moving troops to the Ukrainian border. This began leading us with questions about whether or not Russia was going to invade Ukraine and heighten tensions on the conflict again, and obviously going against the Minsk Accords. Commercial satellite imagery and social media posts revealed the moving of armor, missiles, and heavy machinery in November and December 2021. Russia provided no explanation as to why these were being moved to the border. In December 2021, nearly 1,000 troops were at the border of Russia and Ukraine. There were beginning to be warning signs of Russia possibly invading Ukraine at the start of 2022. In mid-December of 2021, we were faced with a set of demands directed at Ukraine. Russia's foreign ministry stated that Ukraine is banned from entering NATO. There also must be a reduction of NATO troops and military equipment in Eastern Europe. Following both of these would lead to military withdrawal at the border between Russia and Ukraine. These demands were rejected. Instead, the United States and other NATO allies put the pressure back on Russia. They warned that retaliation would occur if Ukraine was invaded, if Ukraine was given economic sanctions, or if Ukraine had any small arms or defensive weaponry. Ultimately, this conflict is leading to a troubling relationship between the US and Russia. If there is an invasion into Ukraine, there will be a response by the United States, especially since it could be harming a NATO ally. The issue at hand is extremely important, but it is ultimately imperative to know that this issue started way before the current issues that are happening today. And YuYu, kind of drawing off of that for a little bit of discussion, right? It's really important to understand this long context. And we can talk about long context when it comes to conflict between anything, because that's usually how conflict begins, right? We've often talked about when it comes like a good comparison for why it's important to understand background is Israel and Palestine, right? Which has a long history that dates back to World War II. And it's important to talk about that because that's how we've gotten to where we are. And the same thing can be said about what's going on between Russia and Ukraine. This long-lasting history, or well, not very long-lasting history, but the conflict, understanding that it dates to 2013, really helps us to understand why issues are escalating, right? It could be possible that Russia liked the president that was in Ukraine before 2014, after they basically pushed him out through violent protests. It could be that Russia really wants to have an influence in Eastern Europe and cause a destabilization of the West, just like what that op-ed wrote. There's a number of different issues pertaining to this conflict that we can understand from the background.
Yeah, I agree with that. I would even say that, like, even if it seems like the conflict has started only in 2013, 2014, it goes further than that. Like, kind of when the USSR was still a thing, Soviet Russia, where they had like Ukraine as part of their territory. But because of concessions given during the war, Ukraine essentially became its like own nation and was independent of Russia. And so there's all this talk about how, or at least like in the international relations realm, about how maybe Russia actually just wants to take back their own land, taking back Ukraine, so that they can become like the country of Soviet Russia as it was before everything had fallen apart. And really trying to understand this history and the reasons why tensions run so deep and why no one is willing to make a concession, especially with this conflict, is really important, because knowing the conflict is just okay, but understanding like why this conflict is essentially happening in the first place and why no one is willing to back down actually gives you a way to make better analysis about the conflict at hand. So thanks to Spencer for all the wonderful points of background. We can now dive in and digest the tensions between Ukraine and Russia now. So the main debate, at least in the international relations realm, around this conflict is whether Russia will actually invade Ukraine and whether they're willing to take that risk. So there's a lot of talk about whether this is actually going to happen. And the main indicator that Russia will invade Ukraine is that they've deployed or will deploy more than 100,000 troops to the Ukrainian border. As of right now, I believe they only have around 70,000 troops there, along with military equipment, weapons, as such. But US intelligence also reported that the plan was to actually have 175,000 troops around the Ukrainian border. So this was the situation that was reported and known since October of last year. This sparks a lot of conversation on what everyone around the area can do to prevent conflicts from arising or from escalating. Turkey has offered to be a mediator between Ukraine and Russia while also supplying Ukraine weapons such as drones. The US has also recently announced that it plans to deploy 2,000 troops to Ukraine and have 1,000 or more troops on standby just in case things do escalate, despite President Biden saying that he doesn't believe deploying troops would be a good idea in this scenario. Obviously, as things tend to escalate, things change, strategies change, so that's completely understandable. But on top of that, NATO countries have also been active in trying to prevent Russian invasion into Ukraine too. So recently, US intelligence has also discovered a fake video of Ukrainian forces attacking Russia. They believe that Russia was going to use this video as a sort of propaganda in order to justify the start of the invasion. And so this was the video that they were going to show, and then they would essentially invade Ukraine, sending their troops there as sort of like a defense against that type of invasion. But obviously, we know that the video is fake. And if Ukraine did actually attack Russia, then Russia would have a really good excuse in starting military conflict. But that is also factoring into the reason why Ukraine is not going to do that, because they don't want Russia to invade. So it doesn't really make sense for Ukraine to send military power into Russia. With this conflict in mind, it shows both to European nations, NATO, and the United States that Russia did actually have intentions of invading, and this was their way of finding that scapegoat. But again, US intelligence had figured it out, showed it to everyone to prevent a situation like that from happening and prevent escalation from happening. So right now, it seems that tensions are very, very high. We have no idea who's going to make the first move, and it seems very scary. But you also have the other side where, with all this information in mind, we also have to talk about the fact that some analysts don't think this will escalate and lead to a full-scale invasion by Russia. See, Russia knows that they would get a lot of criticism and a lot of pushback and fight back if they do invade Ukraine. So it's not a smart strategic decision in order to kind of like have standing in the international sphere. But on top of that, it definitely wouldn't settle well with Ukrainians that are not close to the Russian border, in which they would have a lot of domestic pushback too. So That being said, some analysts believe that Russia is only doing this as a performance tactic, basically putting on a show to get their own goals. Well, why? Well, their main goal is to prevent Ukraine and even Georgia from signing onto a deal with NATO and becoming a NATO ally. If Ukraine did become a NATO ally, then it would be a direct threat on Russia's doorstep. That's why the agreement Putin wants to make in order to prevent invasion is strongly emphasizing that Ukraine doesn't join NATO and that they would give up military power within Ukraine too, as Spencer was talking about. But it's really important for Putin to gain that concession because he does believe that it is a very direct threat on his doorstep, and he doesn't want any more like Western interference in his own political standings and his politics. It's like basically a big threat to his legitimacy, if you want to put it that way. Putin could also be parading his troops as a way to gain more domestic support or more support from the more Russian side of Ukraine. This is in response to COVID-19, to allegations against him for rigging elections and like basically harming his legitimacy as president of Russia. And so a way to kind of boost his popularity and solidify his legitimacy within Russia is to do something like this where it paints the West as the bad guys and like they're trying to attack Russia, and the only way to protect Russia is if Putin stayed in power. One of the reasons why analysts believes this is a reason Putin is doing this is because back in 2014, when Russia had annexed Crimea, his rating has actually went up. Of course, there's contestation about that too, because sure, his ratings might have went up for a little bit, but they also started to decrease again. So the effectiveness of that is in question, and it's not really like a solidified theory that this is what he's doing. But within that, Ukrainian officials also think that the US and Western countries are really blowing this situation all out of proportion. President Zelensky of Ukraine even went on to say that this is an insult to the Ukrainian government and is undermining the faith that the people have in the Ukrainian government to prevent conflict from escalating. As a result, he also accused the Western countries for bringing a lot of economic hardships domestically because he's putting a lot of worry into people's heads for apparently no reason. Officials also note that concessions will have to be made regardless of what happens, but the idea that Russia will actually invade Ukraine and take it all is highly improbable. But regardless of whether Russia is a real threat or not, the US and other NATO and EU countries have continued to supply weapons and people to Ukraine. Of course, Russia doesn't think it's a good idea. They think that it's an indicator of more of a threat, and some people even say that maybe Russia would preemptively attack because of the supplies of weapons and troops into Ukraine. However, some US officials also don't support the decision to deploy more troops into Ukraine. Republican Senator Braun of Indiana stated that he believes this is going to push them back into another war after they had gotten out of a 20-year war, referring to the US involvement in the Middle East. It's good to note that if conflict did escalate, people are worried that it will turn into a World War III scenario, which is very likely if conflict does escalate. Again, if it's war between Ukraine and Russia, it's in reality war between Russia, Western countries, and like Europe, just because of geographical location and factors like that. But then again, like don't panic just yet, because there is a very high chance that conflict does not escalate and concessions will eventually be made regardless. Some believe that recent actions of the US doing more to increase their presence in the Baltic states is unnecessary, and also involvement in Ukraine and nearby countries will only anger Russia and could spark Russia to strike preemptively. But as of now, all we know is that there are troops on both sides of the border, negotiations are trying to happen, and mediation is happening in the status quo too.
And I think that there's a lot of discussion that we can have, right? About really this whole context and what's really going on, right? If Russia is trying to exert more power for itself, right? Which it seems like this could be the possible case. Well, we we tend to understand a little bit about international relations, both of us, and we're both aware of what's called the realist theory of international relations. And basically, this is an idea that says the world is the most stable with one power. Okay, and that we're basically in this what's called an international state of anarchy. There's no one official ruling government, right? There's not a world government that exists. So the best state of power tends to be one power in general, right? So right now we would argue that the United States is the global hegemon. There can only ever be one global hegemon. That's something that we need to remember. For some reason, we don't think that hegemons only exist in ones. Um, so the U.S. is the single hegemon right now. What happens is if we have competition and Russia does try to exert that it's also a global hegemon, well, obviously there's not one. And what happens is conflict does tend to happen. It's not necessarily just conflict in general, it can be tensions like what's occurring right now. It's threats of world stability and who really is the ruling power, who are the people that govern the world, right? In this international state of anarchy. And if you think about this theory in this way, it makes a lot of sense because, well, if you think about just generic world history, right? This philosophy and this theory dates all the way back to the Greeks, where you had to ancient Greece, where they were once the one ruling power of the world. I think that actually goes back way further. I think it goes back to like Mesopotamia, right? And then you can further connect this to the idea of the Roman Empire, and then kind of like the rise of Britain. And then we can talk about, obviously, recently with the United States. Um, so this kind of idea that this is global stability that we're talking about, and every time that there's been this like second actor, threats, tensions begin to start escalating because there seems to be competition for being the global hegemon that could ultimately rule the world.
I think it's a really interesting idea of just like buying the realist vision of things. And I do want to just like say to the audience, like, usually when you're looking at a situation, it's not just that, like, oh, this is definitely realist, or oh, this is definitely like another school of thought, like liberal or constructivist. Usually it's like a combination of all of them. But I would say when looking at this situation, it is mainly done through like a liberal lens rather than a realist one. And that just means that the United States, NATO, what they're trying to do is preserve the liberal international order, which is what they've done through organizations like the WTO, NATO, the World Health Organization, et cetera, where the US or a Western country, a democratic country, is at the top. And the theory behind that is just if all nations are democracies, then war is less likely to happen because democracies are less likely to fight in wars. Um, and so they feel with the threat of Russia as not a democratic nation and a more of like an authoritarian one, that it would be a threat to the LIO, Liberal International Order, if Russia were to invade to Ukraine, gain more ground, gain more leverage, gain more weight in the world. This goes back to a lot of the things that Spencer was saying about hegemony and stuff like that. The US right now tends to view itself as like the leader of the liberal international order, in that it is the one that is leading all of this, making sure that everything is peaceful, that their legitimacy isn't harmed in any way, shape, or form. But Russia would be a direct threat to that, in which why this is a very important step to consider and to like find a good solution to is very important. Because in this sense, the US can't make a concession because it seems like the LIO is dying. But in another sense, Russia won't make a concession because they don't want Ukraine and Georgia to be a part of NATO. Or they don't want the US presence or Western presence around their borders because they view it as a direct threat to their own sovereignty. And I guess just another thing to add to that is like when you are evaluating international relations news, so such as Russia against Ukraine, against NATO, against European nations, United States, stuff like that, you also have to understand that like we're not in a bipolar world anymore in which it is just the threat of Russia versus the United States. It's more of like I would argue, a multiplex world where there are a lot of other factors that contribute to kind of the importance of each situation and stuff like that. There's a rising threat of China also that my professors will always tell you about in my international relations class. But also you have to deal with Russia in a way that doesn't ignore them completely, but also like gives them enough attention to make it matter. And how does all this apply to the Ukrainian situation? It's just all about kind of IR theories and what arguments you can construct from those theories.
To add to that, there's actually an interesting book called The Dragons and the Snakes by David Kilcullen. And this book goes through and it talks about American foreign relations in kind of like the time that we're living in, right? I don't remember when it was published. It's actually a very recent publication. But he has this argument that the dragons or the big powers are disappearing from the world, and he claims that the biggest dragon that's in threat right now or that is a threat to the United States is China, and rather than Russia being a threat, we have all these snakes, and these snakes are terrorist organizations. And because they're always spread out, there's not like one collective group of them, right? And basically he goes through and he explains that Russia, in essence, you have this argument that Russia is a threat to us because they want to try to bring its dragon presence back. And in a lot of ways, that's pretty true. Russia has definitely declined in its threat since the fall of the USSR. It's not as strong as it used to be. And I think Putin understands that, which could be a very good explanation as to why this situation may be very important, because Russia may really be trying to bring itself back onto the global scale. Because in essence, the US has slain a dragon, but the dragon wants to feel like it's not slain. And that's kind of I think that's a good analogy, right? If you want to start an Extemp speech with a good analogy, Russia is a dragon. Okay, it's a dragon that the United States is trying to face. And David Kilcullen, by the way, is a really good author. He writes very, very well, and has very good literature on political science issues, international relations theory. And like he is just a very well-respected author. He does a great job explaining of what Russia kind of looks like in essence. And I don't know where you will take with that, and what you could take of that. But Russia, I feel like Russia still feels defeated, and it wants to regain its presence. And in a lot of ways, it like is trying to rebuild itself as a dragon when like the biggest threat to the US we know happens to be snakes, which means that, using this analogy, the best way for Russia to really try to regain its global presence is being more of like a snake, and trying to be more spread out.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting theory that was brought up because it was also like talked about in my international security class. And I just thought it was like a really interesting analogy. And another thing for the listeners is just if you're reading more about what's going on and like why this is going on, you'll hear or see a lot of the word revisionist or expansionist. And what revisionist means is that it is a state or country that wants to overturn the world order that has been set up. So in this situation, it seems like Russia's revisionist because they want to, deny Western powers the ability to spread the liberal international order and kind of defy that and like make another world order with that, or at the very least, topple the one that's existing. And so you have discussions of how Russia is trying to do that by, invading to Ukraine, parading its power, trying to be more of a threat to the Western countries. But you also have to realize that not only is Russia kind of considered a revisionist country, but China can also be seen as a revisionist country. And in the sense, you get back to the discussion of how the United States or NATO countries, or the West, I guess, as referred to, is focusing their attention on China because they view that as more of a threat than Russia is. In a sense, some people have argued that Russia is using this as an excuse, or not as an excuse, but as like an opportunity to kind of be like, hey, pay attention to me too. Like, I'm a threat too. And not have all of the states focus on China explicitly. And I thought that was like really funny. I mean, I don't think that's necessarily true because there are other reasons as to why Russia would want to have more troops at the border of Ukraine, have this whole situation going on that are more substantive than, hey, I'm lacking a lot of attention right now. Pay attention to me, please. You know. So I think it's good to know the vocabulary, and it's also good to know like the just global general trend of what's going on in the international security realm and who we're focusing on specifically, why we view them as a threat. You'll also hear the word expansionist, which just means like Russia wants to expand its territory. In this sense, it's easier to consider Russia as like expansionist because it seems like they want to expand into Ukraine and like take that land back. Obviously, semantics wise, some people think it's a stretch to say they're expansionist because Ukraine was technically a part of Russia or the USSR before. It just ended up not, situating itself in that way just because of how things fell out. But either way, they are still kind of like taking land back and using aggression or using the threat of aggression as a way to do that. But whether they actually want Ukraine or whether they just want concessions or not is still to be seen.
And I think that leads us perfectly to the ending of this episode. There's obviously a lot to talk about, and by the time this episode publishes, there's a lot of things that we said that is completely outdated. And that's just because things might have changed. We record these on Thursdays, they get published on Wednesdays. So in 6 days, there might be a totally new situation. And we'll try to cover that obviously in the next episode when we talk about questions real fast. Like we'll do a brief, like, here's what's happened since we're still planning that out. We'll see what happens when we get to that episode. But this is a pretty important topic. So we hope you guys enjoyed like a just general background discussion. And personally, I feel like this was just good background discussion between two people, like almost like right at the end we got like good two scholarly like discussions that were going. So this is like really based on good research from both of us. We'll
Yeah.
credit ourselves.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, we're professionals. Okay.
Professional podcasters.
No, I attribute like half the information I know to my professors. So like a shout out to Oriana Schuyler and Melissa Carlson if you're listening to this. But yeah, if you have like any questions at all, I'd be happy to talk to you about it because I'm kind of an IR nerd right now. We could talk. Spencer can talk too because he's also kind of an IR nerd too. But
Specifically political science.
yeah.
But we have to learn international relations theory as a part of our curriculum. So unfortunately, I know a thing or two because I need a thing or two. We are farmers, bump it bump 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 bump.
On that note, I hope you get the one in the round. I hope you do well. If you don't get the one in the round, let us know how you did. Sorry, I gotta mess it up. Let us know how you did. Let us know how we did. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to DM either me or Spencer. We're available on our Instagram almost 24/7 if we were that much of a night owl. But if you are not subscribed to our YouTube channel, please click the subscribe button, ring the bell so that you don't miss any new episodes that comes out earlier than it does on One Clap. But also go support One Clap. Anyway, I hope you have a great rest of your day. Follow us on our socials. Follow us on our Twitter, on our Instagram. It's at Half Hour Extemp Podcast. We're also there.